Thank you everybody for being here. Good morning, and thank you for attending today's training on understanding and supporting Muslim individuals as it relates to our work as probation officers. I'd like to welcome today's speaker, Michael Abraham. Mr. Abraham is an accomplished educator and consultant with over 14 years of experience in improving educational outcomes across various settings. He is the author of the book Engaging Muslim Students in Public Schools and has trained over 4,000 educators from over 200 districts nationwide. Since 2008, Michael has been actively involved in Minnesota's Muslim community, offering programs through mosques and nonprofit organizations. His work focuses on culturally responsive teaching and the empowerment of people facing complex social dynamics. Michael's expertise in educational strategies and community engagement make him a valued contributor to initiatives aimed at supporting at-risk Muslim people. Please note that this session will be recorded today. So without further ado, please welcome our special guest, Michael Abraham.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. So as was said in the introduction, sorry, I'll put this down. As was said in the introduction, most of my work is in public education. I'm going to keep it off right now. I think you'll be able to hear me as I'll move on. I might need it later. Okay. Well, this is only recording on here. So, it might be this. Hello? I'm not sure. Okay. Most of my work is in public education as a public school teacher. And this training, what I'm trying to do here is a probation officer version of what I do for public school teachers. Okay, so there's a metaphor in education that culture is like an iceberg, because an iceberg is really big and you see it and it's imposing above the surface, but most of it actually exists beneath the surface. So what is above the surface is the stuff that you can experience really clearly with your five senses. Food that you taste, different clothing people wear, different languages that people speak. That's all stuff that is very apparent. But the majority of culture is what exists beneath the surface that really you need some modicum of education to understand. So my trainings try to focus on making people see those things, mostly in the educational context, but it does heavily relate to any cultural context, because this type of cultural clash, it's something that is really stressful for any people who are not from the mainstream society. It's certainly stressful for the Muslim community. Muslims who are in the criminal justice system is something that I personally have very high concern about. It is something that is of very high concern to the Muslim community here in Minnesota in general. In general, the Muslim community in Minnesota is immature in supporting people who are in the criminal justice system. There are some Muslim communities in the country, which I'll allude to later, that are very mature in it, that this community needs to learn from, and that you all as people who work in the criminal justice system need to learn from as well. But this community is immature in it. So I'm here to learn a little bit as well. This presentation, it's highly informational. I tend to be pretty good at just talking, so I will just keep talking. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and ask it at any time. My experience, once the group is above like 15, 20 people are a little hesitant to ask questions. So I will leave maybe 15 to 30 minutes at the end to just keep it open for questions. I have time today, so I hope if some of you have time, you can approach me afterwards, because I do want to learn more details about the day-to-day experience of what probation officers do. Because as a teacher, I know that stuff. So I'm able to relate that very closely to teachers. For probation officers, I'm still looking to learn that type of thing. What I will go over is, number one, history. Okay, history of understanding how Muslim communities have formed in America, and particularly here in Minnesota. Understanding that history is really the most important thing to understanding the diversity that exists within our Muslim community in Minnesota and the different implications for how people exist here as Muslims in America. Probably many of you might have grown up in the 90s, 80s, maybe the 70s, and you might not have grown up in that time with much of a concept of there being a Muslim community in Minnesota. So there's historical reasons for that. And the demographic change that's kind of gone on is something that everyone is grappling with. Then I will go into teachings about the religion, like the basic teachings about the religion, beliefs, and technical practices, and really how it intertwines with everyday life, and things that you have to know to avoid sensitivities, and things about how it can affect a Muslim's psychology. And, I like to try to point out to people some points of leverage that exist to increasing people's behavior, their positive behavior, and understand how religious teachings really are a primary source for that in Muslim culture. It's kind of unavoidable. And when that type of thing can only exist beneath the surface, it can be very difficult for people. This is certainly something that is a struggle in the public education system. So that's the cover of my book that was introduced already. Okay, this is about teachers. There's plenty of research within education that shows that this type of training needs to be done. Okay, how Muslim communities formed in America is essentially along three different historical, socioeconomic patterns, if you will. The first is African American convert communities. This means communities that formed of African Americans who were descended from slaves who converted to Islam. Second is professional class immigration. Third is refugee class immigration. So African American convert communities formed from black nationalist movements that started in the early 20th century. Sometime after the Civil War, when African Americans got that amount of freedom, and some people decided that they wanted to form an African American identity that did not revolve around being Christian, primarily from knowing that their history, historically, where slaves came from in East Africa, are regions that are today anywhere from 30 to 90% Muslim. So many people ascertained that their actual ancestry was not a Christian ancestry. It was more likely to be a Muslim ancestry. Now, at the time in the early 20th century, the amount of information that was available to people about Islam in the country was very, very limited. So normally the type of understanding that these groups adopted as far as what it meant to be Muslim was considered heretical in the Muslim world and didn't accord to the way Islam is practiced in the Muslim world. The most famous of these groups was a group called the Nation of Islam, which was led by a man named Elijah Muhammad and had a very, very famous spokesperson named Malcolm X. You've heard of Malcolm X? Raise your hand. Or Malcolm X? Okay. So if you've not read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you really, really should. If you have people who have been incarcerated and are dealing with the issues that come up with that, especially if they are male, which I believe a higher percentage of incarcerated people are male, this is a good book to encourage people with a Muslim identity to read. If you don't know the story about Malcolm X and this autobiography, he went through a whole life transformation of being incarcerated himself for a long time, of beginning to reform his character while he was incarcerated on a religious basis after being involved in drugs and crime and prostitution and all that type of stuff beforehand. So the whole kind of psychological journey that a person goes through with that is all in that book. The book is written in a really masculine tone that young men in particular relate to. I taught high school in South Minneapolis for a very long time. A lot of times for many of my students, this is the first book that they ever read cover to cover because of the way that it touches them. Also, too, when he goes into his history with the Nation of Islam, the reason that the African Americans descended from slaves up until 2010 were the highest single demographic of Muslims in the country. Even today, 1 out of every 4 Muslims in America is an African American descended from slaves. Now, we have less of them here, though we do have some. Masjid an-Nur in North Minneapolis is a community based on people of this background. Why? Because these black nationalist groups, they more formed in cities that were primary destinations during the African American migration north in the early 20th century. So Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, Detroit, Boston, Newark, New Jersey. Those cities, they have long-held communities of Muslims. And in the book, Malcolm X goes over the type of social programs that the Nation of Islam had concerning drug rehabilitation, concerning helping people reform from gang activity and reform in prison. And those systems in those communities are kind of still in place. Okay, so in 1973, when Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, died, his son Warith Deen Muhammad took it over. His son Warith Deen Muhammad had studied Islam in Egypt. So he actually rejected the heretical beliefs that his father had. He encouraged everyone in the nation, and their membership was in the hundreds of thousands at that time, to adopt an orthodox understanding of Islam. So in those communities out there, the African-American Muslim communities are actually very, very well known and have a good reputation for doing work and reforming people from criminal activity, and particularly within the prison system. So again, this is something, and having programs like that our community here in the Twin Cities really, really needs, and we're immature in it. So it is something for you to research further. You can start by reading this book and even introducing young people to this kind of historical background, especially because we have such a high percentage of Muslims in Minnesota who are black. So where can they look for people who have exhibited a black identity while being Muslim? It's in those cities where the Nation of Islam was big and where they have large numbers of African American Muslim communities. So that's the first recommendation. Get the autobiography of Malcolm X. Read it, recommend it to people, okay? Professional class immigration, 1965. Why is that a significant year? Because that is when the Immigration Act passed, which was an offshoot of the Civil Rights Act. That act got rid of racial quotas in United States immigration law that were put in place in the early 1920s. That opened the door for professional class immigration to take place from the Muslim world. So starting with 1965, you start having people come on student visas. You start having people come on business investor visas. You start having influxes of people coming to fill different economic niches where visas were opened up for it, especially from countries where the education system had been reformed through British colonization to really include English language instruction in the education system. So India, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, Kenya is another one. Countries such as that. Other countries where there were like specific economic interests, such as integration with the petroleum industry in Iraq. Even smaller things. There's a stereotype of like the Arab or South Asian taxi driver in New York City. That is because in the 1970s, visas were opened up for people, particularly from Egypt and Bangladesh, to come to New York City and be taxi drivers. Sometimes it's lower, things like that. And those communities, usually when people come in that immigration style, they kind of come with the idea they're going to come here, they're going to get professional expertise, they're going to get an education, then they're going to go back and help their developing country. Generally, they tend to stay in the country is what happens. And then they get citizenship. And then when they get citizenship, they can bring more family members. If a conflict breaks out in their home country, sometimes people who have family members here, they can get through the refugee process a little quicker and resettle here. So you have like this type of immigration start to trickle in 1965, and then it kind of builds up exponentially up until about 2010. And some people from that background, they've been here 50 years. Some of them have grandkids, even great-grandkids in the country now, but you still have the largest amount of this immigration taking place from the late 90s to 2010. Refugee immigration, which certainly affects us here in the Twin Cities. Why is 1980 significant? Because that is when immigration law changed for refugees to allow refugee immigration from places other than places that were being taken over by communism. So prior to 1980, you had to be fleeing the Soviet Union's expansion, or like a place like Vietnam where the Soviet Union was taken over by proxy, or this type of thing. But under the administration of Jimmy Carter in 1980, that was opened up to allow it for other people who were just experiencing a refugee situation generally. So from that time, you have people coming into the United States from places where conflicts are taking place and coming to communities like ours that were in general friendly and open to refugee resettlement. So the conflicts in Lebanon and Syria in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s as well, that brought an influx of immigrants. More recently, there's more immigrants coming from Yemen and Afghanistan. Iraq has this real ebb and flow of refugees depending on how conflicts are taking place. And then, of course, the conflicts in East Africa, which people tend to know about, started refugee immigration from Somalia and Ethiopia in the early 1990s. Now, I like for people to know about the history and for the community in Minnesota and Twin Cities to know the history a little bit more generally about what happened, because sometimes people have an understanding that there was a civil conflict, they couldn't get along with themselves in the early 1990s or whatever, and now they're here, so why do we have to deal with these people resettling? The seed of conflicts in East Africa goes back to World War II. Okay, World War II. In World War II, you had the Allies and you had the Axis powers. And the Allied powers, Britain, they had better allegiance with the government of Ethiopia, whereas Italy, who Britain was against, they had recently been colonizing Somalia. So this region right here of the eastern part of what is within the borders of Ethiopia today, okay, this is called, Somalis will either call this the Ogaden region, or it will just be called Western Somalia. Because what is shaded in pink on here, this is the traditional home of inhabitants of Somali people. So when the borders were drawn for this region after World War II, and Britain and America decided to make the border of Ethiopia like this, it encompassed a whole lot of ethnically Somali people being put into the borders of what is today called Ethiopia. So those people never really agreed to that and never really liked that. And that was always like a simmering tension there. In the 1970s, the Ethiopian government started to have some internal conflicts. And at that time, resistance movements within the Ogaden region, or Western Somalia, or whatever it's called, they decided to try to separate from the Ethiopian government. When they did that, the Ethiopian government did not allow that, and they went to war with those resistance movements. That was in 1974. In 1977, the government of Somalia, which was primarily backed by the Soviet Union, but did actually also have good relations with the United States. In 1977, Siad Barre, the leader of Somalia, he sent the Somali military into the Ogaden region to support the resistance groups. And when he did that, the Soviet Union and the United States flipped on him. And the Soviet Union, they actually had 12,000 military troops from Cuba come into eastern Ethiopia here and fight back the resistance movements. And when they did that, they did it under what they call a scorched earth policy, and they ravaged this region. And that, in 1977, is the seed of the refugee crisis in East Africa. That caused people from here to be devastated, to have to be dispersed all over Somalia in different regions. And that eventually culminated in the civil conflicts that took place in the early 1990s. That also created, the refugee crisis in general. First of all, in Minnesota, we do have people from Somalia from all over, but people are more likely than not to be from this region. Doesn't necessarily mean that their family is still there, because they might have settled in a refugee camp in northern Ethiopia or in northern Kenya, depending on where they dispersed to. But most people are originally in their history more likely than not to be from that region. Of course, the refugee resettlement process is fraught with all kinds of instability. And through this, Somali people, they went through a very, very real breaking up of their culture, losing of their culture. Many parents of young people nowadays were like maybe children when these conflicts were taking place, and they might have grown up in a refugee camp, not really in their traditional cultural home. Very common in the refugee resettlement process, you have all kinds of things going on. You have, maybe the father has to come first and get things settled, which can take years before the rest of the family comes. You might have children who lost their parents in the conflict, and then in the refugee camp, for all intents and purposes, they get adopted by someone else who's not really their blood parent, but then they end up resettling with those people or with extended family members. You might have people who had a different birth name, but then for whatever reason, they adopted a different name to help them get resettled somewhere out of the refugee camp. You have all kinds of lost paperwork or paperwork that was never kept in the first place. If you ever have someone in your caseload who is from Somalia and their birthday is January 1st, it is more likely than not that their birthday is not really January 1st. Just that is the date that was given to them when they tell the UN or whoever's resettling the year that they were born. They just put January 1st on it. And it generally, too, in Muslim culture, birthdays are not celebrated, though it's something that's on the increase in, as there's more contact with Western culture and that type of thing. So, a lot of these things are at the root of, psychological trauma that people can have, okay? So, just a little note on the history. Somalis, they first were resettled in San Diego. Where they first came in Minnesota was not Minneapolis. It was not the Twin Cities. It was actually the small towns in western Minnesota of Wilmer and Marshall, Minnesota. Why? Because they both have poultry processing factories that are the economic engines of the towns. And as the baby boom generation did not have as many children before, and their children were more likely to leave that town, eventually the industry says to the small towns, if you don't get people to work here, we're going to have to leave. And then the politicians go, yeah, we can't have that. We got to get people in here. And they find out there's refugees somewhere who are looking for jobs. And they started recruiting Somalis to work at those poultry factories. That's why I have up here, okay, Wilmer and Marshall, Minnesota, Liberal, Kansas, Dodge City, Kansas, and Shelbyville, Tennessee. All of those are cities with like 30 to 40,000 people, and today about 10, 12,000 of them are Somali people, and almost a quarter of their school districts now are Somali people. Why? What do they have in common? They all have poultry processing factories. So it's not just poultry, it's not the only like economic engine for this, but that phenomenon, that's like a microcosm of what takes place in general. You know, when they came to the Twin Cities, where were they resettled? To the Cedar Riverside neighborhood is where Somalis were first put. You know, so in the 80s, 90s, that neighborhood was like, this artsy hipster kind of town with the college students there. The city planners knew that they were going to move out to the sprawling suburbs. They wouldn't be there for long. So if you don't have people to live there, you're going to have dead property in the middle of downtown Minneapolis and the University of Minnesota campus. And that wouldn't work out very well. So it's pretty much always these economic reasons that are behind the refugee resettlement. And that's why we've seen the patterns. If you're also not aware, too, in Minnesota has a unique program for that gives funds and essentially mandates that all the suburbs have low-income housing. And that project started in the 1990s, and now you're starting to see those developments come up. So through all the suburbs, the school districts, the population of the suburbs are rapidly diversifying because of that, because there's low-income housing available. And there's more and more people looking to leave Minneapolis and that type of thing because of this. Okay. Now, I do like to show people something I show to educators. Of course, East African people are very highly at risk with all these different factors. The largest survey ever done of young people, of Somali young people, was the 2017 Minnesota State Survey. Had over 4,000 Somali youth participate in it. It showed that Somali youth, they're less likely than the average Minnesotan to use marijuana, less likely than the average Minnesotan to abuse alcohol, and less likely than the average Minnesotan to experience adverse childhood effects. And the Minnesota Department of Health did an analysis of this, and they determined that that is due to the strong cultural roots that the community has. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't still high concern about these things. And also, too, that surveying did find at that time that Somalis are a little more likely than average to abuse opioids. And that is something that has certainly only increased since that time. Many people asked on the intake form about culturally relevant support for Muslims for substance abuse. So if you don't know, neither of these are in Dakota County, but Alinus Wellness Center in Bloomington is run by Yusuf Shafi, who is someone who was born and raised here. They especially deal with people recovering from opioids. They have in-house treatment. They have beds. They will take people in like that. And NIA Recovery is a program based out of Cedar Riverside in Minneapolis. It's more by Farhia Boudel, who I used to teach her son in school. And she's someone who went through substance abuse herself, has been very open about it, and it's more of kind of like an AA type format where they have support groups and this type of thing. So, and I will share the slides with you guys afterwards. I'll email it out and everything. But those are two resources that I strongly recommend reaching out if substance abuse is the issue that you're concerned with. Was there a hand raised? Did I see a hand raised? Okay. This is an interesting book to check out. I get into it more with teachers, but it's a book that was published by the APA in 2011. It shows that it went over long-term studies of the children of immigrants, and it actually showed that the more that a child from an immigrant family assimilates into American culture, the more likely they are to have negative outcomes in school and career success and mental and physical health choices. And for ones who assimilated less, the inverse is actually true. Okay? So getting into culture and the religion, it's intertwined with culture. Okay? So this word is pronounced Muslim. Okay? Muslim. Okay? It's not actually pronounced Muslim. Okay? Muslim is what you call an anglicization of the word, meaning it's a rendering of a word from a different language into English to maybe make it easier to pronounce for people who speak English. So in Arabic is the base language of Islam. It's the language of the religion of Islam. Of course, the majority of Muslim people do not speak Arabic as their home language, but most people have some phonetic familiarity with it so that they can read Islamic texts. in the Arabic language, the letter that is represented by S here, it never makes the Z sound, okay? The English S can make the sound S or Z, depending on the word that it's in. The Arabic letter Sin never does that. So Muslims, we don't say Muslim. We don't call each other that. We only say Muslim. And same for this word, which is pronounced Islam or Islam. It's not pronounced Islam, okay? So number one, if you see someone on the news talking about Muslims or Islam and they pronounce it with the Z sound, it might be something of a giveaway. Might be that they don't really know what they're talking about, which happens a lot, okay? Secondly, so someone asked about the meaning of the words. The word Islam is the name of the religion. Okay, you can call it Islam or Islam, whichever you're more comfortable saying. You don't have to call it the Muslim faith. I don't know, something about Americans, they like to call it the Muslim or the Muslim faith. You can just call it Islam. It's the name of the religion. Islam means submission to God. That's what it means. I mean, the root of the word is submission. In the religious context, it means submission to God. And Muslim comes from the same word, okay, in Arabic, when you put in the Arabic letter mim, which is represented by M in front of something, it makes it into a noun. So Islam means submission to God. Muslim means one who submits to God or one who strives to submit to God. So the name of the religion is Islam. One who practices the religion or identifies with the religion is called a Muslim, okay? Now, to understand about how Islam is a framework and how it operates in people's lives, and of course, you cannot generalize to everybody, and everyone has a different experience, but you also can't get into the specifics of people's personal experience without some general understandings. Okay, Islam is a text-based religion. It does not have an organization or a hierarchical structure anywhere that gets to say definitively what it is and it is not. It is a text-based religion. That's what the source of it is. Certainly has nothing akin to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and some sort of supreme leader like the Pope or something like that who gets to say what the religion is and is not or anything like that. There is also really no concept in Islam of similar to being devoted to a single parish or you belong to this single mosque. Mosques are called a masjid by Muslims, by the way. There's nothing like that. Okay, a mosque is a place where prayers take place, and it's a place where you go to pray. It might be a place where you go to the sermon on Friday. It might be a place where you go to classes to learn. For young people especially, and older people too, might be where you go to learn and read and memorize the Quran, which is the first and the primary text that the religion is based on, but not the only one. What mosque do you go to? It's usually the one that's closest to where you live, usually. Sometimes it's not uncommon in the suburbs, especially the Somali community, because they really got going in Minneapolis. There are families in the suburbs who they will go into the mosque in Minneapolis. Sometimes might have a connection there. Young people, when they're young, they tend to spend weekends in the mosques, especially learning to read Arabic phonetics and learn and read and memorize the Quran. A lot of Muslim young people growing up, they had this, what academics call a double schooling experience, where they had one schooling experience Monday through Friday and a whole other one on Saturday and Sunday. Sometimes kids experience that as the Saturday Sunday school was more restrictive, and it was something that took their weekends away growing up. Sometimes they had an experience in school, especially as they got older, that when they got into school, that was the place to let loose a little more because there wasn't religious guilt there and there wasn't religious admonishment and that type of thing. So sometimes kids their disaffection from school and their misbehavior things get seeded when they're younger there. Okay, the Quran, Muslims, believe it's a divine revelation, the literal spoken word of God to a man who lived in the 7th century, who's referred to as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the second source of Islamic texts that the religion is based on is a body of literature that is called hadith, which record the sayings, the approvals, the actions of the Prophet Muhammad, his commentary on the verses of the Quran, as well as those by the first 3 generations of Muslims who followed him, who also have authoritative weight in the religion. So Islam is a very, very legalistic religion. The Prophet Muhammad's life is recorded in very, very minute detail, and there is some sort of religious ruling over almost anything that a person can do in life, especially concerning daily habits. These are, if you go into a mosque, this is what a typical library will look like in a mosque, and you see all these different books where the binding runs together, big volumes of hadith literature, of rulings of Islamic scholars over the time. Sometimes it's an anxiety thing for Muslims in the West, because in the Muslim world, religious education is intertwined with your 5-day-a-week education. So the kids kind of grow up here, and it's like, there's a basic education that the parents want the kids to get that they don't. And the kids tend to be all over the place with the type of, and even older people, when I say kids, I mean young adults here as well, or anyone grown up here. They tend to be kind of all over the place with the type of religious education that they got, because it was scattered, it was fit into corners somewhere. And also, too, the memorizing of the Quran, certainly East African people, Arabic is not their first language. Even many people who Arabic is their first language, they usually know a colloquial dialect, which is not necessarily the same as the classical dialect that the Quran is in. So the Quran reciting it is a whole science that you can learn, of how you recite it, how you decode Arabic phonetics, but you can learn it all and learn how to recite the Quran without really knowing what it means. And that is the majority of education that people who grow up in the West get. Why? Because when they're crammed in the mosque on weekend schools and they're kind of uppity, they're generally not taught by people who are like professional teachers, who are professional in getting kids to listen, or classroom management, that type of thing. So they tend to really lean on the Quran recitation because it keeps kids busy, because it's like this constant practice of reciting, and it keeps them under control. But you can have kids who might have gotten a lot of that education growing up, but they didn't necessarily learn the details of the religion. There's a whole conundrum that the community kind of faces. Okay? Now, the foundation of the religion and Islamic law and Islamic jurisprudence is that there's one of 5 rulings that can be applied to literally any action that a person can do in life. This is a system that's put in place by those first 3 generations of Muslims. It's still taught today. It's at the basis of Muslim culture, which affects 2 billion people worldwide, and it really affects a Muslim's mental schemata, because you have to evaluate everything that you can do in life through these types of lens. That system works where on one end of the spectrum you have a ruling of things that are obligatory, which means things that you have to do. You have to do it the way that it's said to be done in Islamic texts, and if you do it, you get rewarded for it, or you get a good record on your deeds. You get a good deed on your record of deeds that will be brought before you, and that you'll be held accountable in the life after this one when you meet God. But if you neglect or fail to perform those obligatory deeds, you just don't do them, then you will get bad deeds on your record that will be brought before God, that you will stand before God and be held accountable for in the next life, especially if you do not repent to God for that before you die. So Islamic teaching is very, very big on accountability for actions. And being a Muslim, it doesn't guarantee one reward necessarily in the next life. You have to earn it, and there's this accountability factor. And with the things that are obligatory, they're small, but they are things that come up constantly, the amount of them. Just neglecting them can weigh on a Muslim psychology, because if you just neglect them, you incur sin, essentially. Okay? On the other end of the spectrum, you have things that are forbidden, which the word for that is haram. You've maybe heard that before. If you're around Muslim people enough, you'll hear that eventually. That's things that are forbidden has the inverse definition of what's obligatory. It means it's something you can't do, something explicitly said in Islamic text, you can't do it. And if you do it, you will incur bad deeds on your record for the next life. But likewise, if you discipline yourself and withhold from doing them, then you will get good deeds just for practicing that self-discipline. What type of things are forbidden? Again, they are few in number, but it's basically religious stuff. Okay, lying, not killing, not cheating, not having relations outside of marriage, all that type of stuff. Gambling, I think people know, is forbidden in Islam. The consumption of alcohol and, by extension, intoxicants as well is actually very strictly, I know that some people in our community have issues with it, but it's something very strictly forbidden in the religion. Okay, in one step in from things that are obligatory, I have things that are encouraged. There's more things in this category. That means these are things that you glean from the life of the Prophet Muhammad and Islamic teachings, that these are good things to do. But if you do them, you get good deeds for it. But if you don't do them, there's no bad deed. Likewise, one step in, you have things that are discouraged, which means that, against inverse definition, it means that these are things there's not enough evidence in Islamic text to say that you are forbidden from this, but you glean from the life of the Prophet Muhammad and Islamic teachings that this is something that's best left stayed away from. So therefore, if you choose to not do that, you get rewarded for it. But if you fall into it, there's no sin recorded for you on it. And then in the middle, you have things that are neutral, which means if an Islamic scholar is asked about this issue, they glean what they know of from Islamic texts. They say you can't say one way or the other. This is part of how you get variety in practice amongst Muslims. It's one of the ways that you do. There is literally like different things you can take and choose from. Okay, growing a beard is an example of that. And there's different schools that have different rulings on this type of thing. In some schools, the beard is obligatory. In some, it's obligatory so long as it's at least a fistful. Others, just on the chin, all this type of thing. There's some rulings, like, if you are in a society and you have to shave it for some reason, then it's okay to do it. Things like women's clothing can be affected by that and all that type of thing. But the obligatory stuff, the base stuff that is obligatory, is stuff that you need to know about because it really affects everyday life. It's something I teach educators about. It might actually pertain to you guys. But music is a thing where there's kind of a variety of rulings in Islamic teachings. Okay, you could read the Quran front to cover and not know that it's commonly ruled by Islamic scholars that listening to music is forbidden, especially music that entails something other than vocals and percussion, such as woodwind or stringed instruments, and certainly playing it. But that's because if you look at the Hadith commentary on this verse that prohibits idle talks, it becomes clear that it's specifically referring to music. Now, there's an exception for weddings. There's an exception for Islamic holiday celebrations. Even within that, there can be different rulings. There's some schools where they rule that it's okay during weddings and celebrations, but only for women and not for men. And this type of variation exists. In general, in our communities, again, it's commonly seen, certainly by parents, for young people getting involved in illegal activity, that the culture of music in the West plays a big part in that. Because even Muslim families who they might listen to cultural music back home, they will see a stark contrast between that and the kind of vice-promoting culture that exists in music in the society. And certainly, I certainly know, working in Minneapolis amongst Somali youth, it's a really big thing that is driving gang culture in Somali youth if you're not aware of that. In 2017, some kids from, if you're not aware, okay, there's these kind of gang battles between Cedar Riverside, the kids in Cedar Riverside and on Carmel Mall in Minneapolis. And, around maybe 2015, 2016, when it started to get easier to post on YouTube and you have Snapchat and stuff, they started getting into like rap battles, okay? And the kids, especially on Cedar Riverside, went like mega viral, okay? You can look up Minnesota Cold TV. There's this guy in St. Paul who he posts like street rappers. Some kids from Cedar Riverside have some of the highest views on that channel. And since that point, and with Snapchat and TikTok, gang activity has been something that's gone on since the kids came here. See it in some stuff that went on with Roosevelt High School in the year 2000. But, for a long time in the community, it was like, there's those kids doing that, but, we're kind of keeping everyone separate from that. But since this whole viral rap thing and the interconnection with social media, now, for Somali kids, even if they are not involved in that, that has the social attention of everybody. And it is affecting the young people in the suburbs quite a bit. Because even if they're from the suburbs, then they feel this pressure to be like, well, I'm with the Cedar crew, or I'm with the Carmel Mall crew, or this type of thing, or we're going to make our own crew here at Eden Prairie or Burnsville or wherever, and all that type of stuff. So this that whole type of culture. And Somalis, if you're not aware, they have really, really vast networks on social media. Okay, just go to TikTok and put in the hashtag Somali TikTok and just see how many videos it has. It's probably over 3 billion at this point. And the same was true with Facebook before that and Snapchat. And they're just very interconnected in the diaspora in general. Because Minnesota has more Somalis than any place outside of Africa, Minnesota has a central place in the consciousness of the Somali diaspora generally. So what has gone on now with the young people being involved and getting lots of attention on social media with this type of misbehavior, like a narrative has developed on Somali social media that the Muslim kids in Minnesota, the Somali kids in Minnesota, they're all like terrible. And if you send your kids there, they're going to become ghetto and all this type of stuff. And what you see happening with the young people is that narrative is starting to like settle into their consciousness. Because young people especially, they tend to manifest what is projected onto them. So they start saying, oh, like, okay, everyone thinks we're like that. Yeah, we're supposed to be like that. And we're supposed to act like that. And it's something that, you can't go talk to elders in the community and change this or something like that. Because this is beyond anything that they feel they have a grasp of. It's something that in the education system, the criminal justice system, everyone needs to get on board. And we need as much help as possible with mitigating this type of phenomenon. Now, again, it's still seated, there is still older people who were involved in this stuff from a long time ago, and this whole thing has kind of influenced, people in their 30s who are maybe involved in this stuff, their influence on younger people as well. Okay. Sorry, a little spiel about music. Okay, Islam, you've heard of the five, raise your hand if you've heard of the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay, good. Okay, that's a direct teaching from the religion. Because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said Islam has been built on 5 pillars. So there's a really strong connotation between being able to observe the 5 pillars and your Islam being in place. Okay? The first pillar is to bear witness that there's none worthy of worship except Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And the messenger of Allah is like an appellation given to the Prophet Muhammad. People know a little better now. The word Allah is the Arabic word for God, but the Arabic letters Aleph Lam, which are represented by AL in the word, is the definite article in Arabic, and the word Allah means God or deity or object of worship. So the word Allah, it actually means the God, and it demonstrates the central idea of Islam, which is monotheism. Okay, belief in one God is the most important part of Islam. A good part of what the Quran does and is it gives definition to God for the Muslim and how the Muslim is supposed to understand God. So this is a short chapter from the Quran, the 112th chapter. It's one of the first chapters kids learn how to recite. It says, say, He is Allah, the One, Allah the Eternal, on whom all depend. He begets not, nor is He begotten, and there's nothing comparable unto Him. This line about there being nothing comparable unto God, it demonstrates a very important Islamic concept of separation between God the Creator and the creation, which is everything we can experience with our 5 senses. In Islamic belief, those entities are separate and they are not like one another. And it is a violation of this first pillar to ascribe attributes of the creation to the Creator, and likewise attributes of the Creator to the creation. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that a Muslim can't attribute metaphysical cause to anything other than God. What does that mean in even more practical terms? What I always tell the teachers is it means a Muslim kid is not supposed to be out at recess and say, if you step on a crack, you will break your mother's back. Because in Islamic belief, the crack does not have that type of metaphysical ability. Okay, it means a Muslim is not supposed to knock on wood after something is said that you want to ward off misfortune in the future. It means they're also not supposed to cross their fingers and hope that something bad will not happen. It means they're not supposed to believe that walking under a ladder or a black cat crossing their path is going to bring misfortune. Okay, it means that they are not supposed to believe that because they were born on a certain day, they have some certain sign, and that is supposed to give some premonition into what will happen in the future and all that type of stuff. That stuff is not only stuff that you're supposed to do, but partaking in that is actually a violation of this first pillar, and this first pillar is the most important part of the religion. So it is actually, as far as your reckoning on the day of judgment, it is actually the most serious sin that a Muslim can commit. So sometimes this is tough for people who are raised in the West because there's a lot of these types of, little isms everywhere, and people might be in that habit of you just say knock on wood or whatever after it. But it's not an appropriate way to relate to a Muslim. For parents, okay, a whole thing with the different ways that families come here. People who come through professional class immigration, they would have had some sort of preparation to be in the West before they came here. At minimum, English language education and some telling of, if you're a man, you're going to shave your beard, wear a suit. If you're a woman, you're not going to wear the hijab. You're going to, wear the shoulder pads if it's the 1980s, all that type of stuff. If you're coming for, okay? And I mean, it's that literal type of education that gets done in some of those schools back home, international schools and things. But people who come through the refugee process, it's really hit or miss with that type of thing. And for the refugee community here in Minnesota, the education rates are maybe 25% of people who have an education beyond 8th grade. And for women, it's lower than men. So, so then when they come here, they can't, this type of stuff, they can't navigate all that. And sometimes kids, they adopt these habits, and it's anxiety inducing for families when they realize what's going on and all this type of stuff. And, for parents growing up here, having a sense of protection for kids is always something that's been very, very anxiety inducing. There's 25 charter schools in the Twin Cities that are all Somali people, all Somalis. And part of that was a reaction to not having control over this type of stuff in the school system and not really getting the school districts to be able to understand these types of cultural clashes and that type of thing. So I started charter schools instead. Okay? So that's the definition of God, and there's a lot to it. Even luck, okay? A lot of times, contextually, there's times where you say good luck to a person, and that's a habit that a kid might adopt growing up here. But really, the concept of luck it's an anti-Islamic concept. And for Muslims, the religion gives us all types of Arabic phrases that in all these little circumstances that come up that you say to someone that is religious instead. So if you're telling me you have a job interview tomorrow, if you're a Muslim, I'll say to you, Allah ya'ainak, which means may God help you. If you are not Muslim, because I know well enough, I'm not going to say good luck, because I know it violates my religion, so I'll think of something secular to say, I hope that works out for you, or this type of thing. And, sometimes, identity crises, it's a big thing with young people growing up here, and just that type of navigating of, living in the culture with the cultural clashes that exist is something that they never really had. And, the idea settling into people at young ages that's maybe they can't really do Islam because it's too hard here, becomes a very, very real thing. Especially if you know about adolescent psychology. Adolescents, they're very good at switching who they are from one place to another. But then when you get into your mid-20s, your brain starts to stiffen, and you kind of can't do that anymore. And, sometimes you have to pick one way or another and all that type of thing. That type of guilt complex can especially come up when it comes to performing the second pillar, which is what you call salah, which is prayer. Someone show me with your hands, how many times a day do Muslims have to pray? Usually there's someone who knows this. Okay, good. Yeah, 5 times a day Muslims are supposed to pray. Okay, now those 5 daily prayers are the second pillar of Islam. And it doesn't mean just speaking to God from your heart or putting your hands in the air and calling out to God and asking him for help or protection of ones you loved or anything like that. You can do that type of praying in Islam. You do that type of praying, but it's separate from these 5 daily prayers. These 5 daily prayers are a very exact liturgical process of which there are very clear rules about how you do it, when you do it, and where you do it. And it really affects your daily life. It certainly affects scheduling. And in the Muslim world, in the entire societies are organized around accommodating these prayers. Okay, when business meetings happen, when school schedules are set, when meetings with other people are set, when you go to the dentist, how houses are constructed, how entire neighborhoods are designed. All of that is done in mind in the Muslim world, revolving around how to accommodate these prayers. And the reality is, you really can't do these. It's extremely difficult to do the 5 daily prayers consistently without some modicum of environmental accommodation. And because as a Muslim in the West, you are constantly in environments that are controlled by non-Muslims who don't know these rules, it's this constant uphill battle. And it is having a serious mental health effect, I would say, on Muslims in the West, because even religious Muslims struggle to do these 5 daily prayers. And the likeliness that you are to do it in any setting is congruent with the types of accommodations that are there. When you are scheduling things with clients and all that type of stuff, you certainly need to know the information that I'm going to give you so that you can understand the type of factors that are at play. First of all, I like to show this hadith to people, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, "Indeed, the first deed by which a servant, meaning a Muslim, will be called to account on the day of resurrection is his salah. If it's complete, he's successful and saved. But if it is defective, he's failed and lost." So
while the first pillar is the most important belief, the second pillar is the most important external action that a Muslim does. And it has very high psychological weight on a Muslim whether or not you can perform it. Because it's explicitly taught in the religion, everyone knows this hadith, that it's the most important thing that you do, okay? So first of all, time. How do the prayers work and when are they done, okay? It's not based on a specific time, but rather it's based on time frames. Those time frames are based upon the position of the sun in the sky or beyond the eastern and western horizons. The first prayer time frame comes into being when the first white light of the dawn is apparent in the eastern skyline. And the time frame for that ends when the sphere of the sun is first visible in the eastern skyline. The time frame for the second prayer begins after the sun has reached its zenith in the noon sky and begun its declination. The time frame for that one ends when the afternoon prayer time comes in, which is when the sun has declined to such an extent that if it casts a shadow on an inanimate object, the shadow will be the same size as the actual object. The time frame for that one ends at the time of the beginning of the sunset prayer, which is when the sphere of the sun has gone beyond the western horizon. And the time frame for that one ends when the time frame for the night prayer begins, which is when the twilight of sunset is gone and the sky is completely blackened. So now, thankfully, nowadays, Muslims don't need to be like looking out at the sun and measuring shadows or this type of stuff because all of this is perfectly calculatable mathematically. And you can look up when it is. Google has finally gotten to the point where if you look up Islamic prayer times and put in your zip code, it should give you the times for the different prayers where you're at. From one end of the Twin Cities to another, there's 10 minutes of difference. And it's even more if you go north to south because of the latitude change. We don't deal with elevation change too much in Minnesota, but that's another factor that plays into it. So, there can be, so this affects schedules, it affects family schedules, it affects sleep patterns. Now I'm showing you December 17th. This is like Hennepin County on December 17th, where the daytime is very, very short. All right, so these are really, really condensed time frames. Now, if you compare that to a few weeks from now in June, where the daylight is really, really long, okay, just observe the change. So the first prayer, 6:18 is now 3:31, 12:10 is now 1:15, 2:16 is now 5:23, 4:34 is now 9:02, 6:03 is now 10:58 p.m. Those changes happen like 1 or 2 minutes a day, gradually, as the daylight increases, with two hard changes in March and November with daylight savings. That just changes the time by an hour because it doesn't change the sunlight at all. So, this has a big effect on sleep schedules. Okay, it does affect punctuality in Muslim culture a fair bit. Sometimes Muslims are stereotyped as not being punctual, and there is an extent to which we are. In the Muslim world, in Muslim culture, I worked in the Muslim world for 3 years. If we had a meeting after work, it didn't take place at 5:30. It would take place after Asr, the afternoon prayer. Which what does that mean? It means the prayer time's going to come in. They're going to broadcast the call to prayer throughout the city. Here, we'll get the notification on our phones. And you can look up Muslim Pro. You can look up the app Pillars. Those are 2 apps that will give you the prayer times. You can have them on there all the time if you want. Which means the prayer time will come in. We will go to our neighborhood mosque or the mosque near where we're meeting. And after we've done the prayers, we will gradually gather to the meeting place. And once we're there, then we'll have the meeting. It's more like that. If you got to go to the mechanic or you got to go to the dentist in the Muslim world, you don't schedule a meeting to the minute 2 weeks out ahead of time, okay? What you do more likely is the day where you have free time, you go to that place and you get your service. And in turn, what you're going to do when you go to that place, you're going to be willing to wait when you get there. So you don't mind sitting around so much. But the institution, for its part, it's going to make waiting very, very comfortable. So they're going to have a really big guest room with very, very comfortable couches. They're going to have water, the hot water dispenser with the Lipton tea bags, sugar, okay, maybe some dates, things like this, okay? So I'm sure you guys have work that kind of depends on punctuality to a fair degree. So like the kind of to-the-minute punctuality that we expect in Western culture, in large part, it's something that Muslims are getting used to. In schools, I get asked all the time why families don't come to conferences on time, why they don't come to such and such after-school activity that they're happening, And, for Muslims, like, okay, I will show schools this. Okay, November 6th, let's say. All right, say you want someone to be somewhere from 5 to 6:30, okay? On November 6th, well, if I'm a Muslim, okay, I have to pray between 4:56 and 6:18. So if I have to be there at 5, is 4:56 to 5 enough time for me to do the prayer, get out the door, and get there in time and look like a nice punctual person? It's not. If I have to be there till 6:30, well, I'm not going to have time to do it, to get out in time to do it. So is there going to be a room that I know for sure will be there that's quiet? Am I going to have appropriate washing facilities, which I'll get into a moment here, to be able to do the prayer there? Am I confident in that? Probably not. And if I'm not confident in that, what becomes kind of the culture is you just don't go to these things at all. You end up just skipping it because it's like it becomes too much to navigate. Certainly families do that in their engagement with the school system. And sometimes that's the habit that people can pick up when they're growing up as well. Okay? Now, like with the prayer, before you can pray, you have to get into a state where you are able to do the prayers, which involves having to do a ritual washing routine. Okay, this is called the wudu in Arabic, a W-U-D-U. So if I go to the mosque or I'm with my family members or something, we're going to pray, I will ask the other person, do you have wudu? And if they say yes, then okay, that means you're ready to pray. We can start praying. If they don't have wudu, it means they have to go wash. Okay? And this affects bathroom habits very, very much. There are very particular bathroom etiquette habits in Islam that are practiced throughout the entirety of Muslim culture based on the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There's entire books written about how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used the bathroom, which I'll get into. So the ritual washing is a routine where you get your hands wet, you get water into your mouth, spit it out 3 times, siphon water into your nose and blow it out 3 times. Get water in your hands and wash it over your face 3 times. You wash both of your arms from the wrist to the elbow 3 times. You get your hands wet and put it over your head and around your neck and in and out of your ears once, and then you wash your feet up to the ankles, each one 3 times. So doing it, number 1, it takes some time. Number 2, it involves a degree of disrobing, especially for females who cover because they have to get the head and everything, so you need a modicum of privacy to do it. Excuse me. Also, too, like bathroom facilities in the West are generally not made to accommodate this. So, like, if you don't have a floor drain, water gets everywhere when you do this. So when you're in the Muslim world, the sinks will be much deeper, so you can fit your arm underneath it. You'll have squeegees in there, so on the counter you can just wipe. There'll always be a counter to catch the water, number 1. The sink won't just end. So then when the water falls off your arms and you take the squeegee, you can just wipe it in there. And then on the floor, your feet get wet or whatever, you have the floor drain in there. So, those are little cultural clashes that Muslims go through all the time. Now, what breaks your wudu? Once you make wudu, what breaks your wudu is essentially ejecting anything from your private areas, the front end or the back end, including flatulence, as well as having intimate relations with your spouse. So, usually, a few things with that. Usually people don't go, you're not going to go from the morning prayer to the noon prayer without having to make wudu again. Sometimes people are in the habit that anytime they go to the bathroom, they make wudu after it. Sometimes that's the habit. But also there's other bathroom habits that are just a part of Islamic etiquettes to observe. Primarily, number 1, it's forbidden for males to urinate standing up in Islam, unless you have no other choice. Okay? If you are in the house of a Muslim and you're a male, it is rude to urinate in their bathroom standing up. That is something that, they might not say anything if you do it. I don't know if you guys get in those situations or whatever, but that is something that is experienced as that is gross in Muslim culture to do. Okay? It is part of Islamic etiquette to wash your private areas with water, both the front end and the back end, each time you use the bathroom, whether you do number 1, number 2, or both. So in the Muslim world, toilets almost always will have this hose connected to it. Okay? If you go to a mosque or you go to a halal restaurant, you will usually see this thing on the left in the bathroom stalls, which to most people in Minnesota, that looks like a plant pitcher. But to Somali kids growing up here, that's the thing that you fill up with before you go in the stall because there's no hose, so then you use that to wash yourself, okay? You can look up medical cleansing bottle on Amazon, okay? It's usually something used for feminine hygiene, but it's a nice bottle. You squeeze it, creates a spraying mechanism. You can also look up portable bidet. That's something they have now. It's an even better bottle that some people in England invented. If you had those available like here, that'd be nice, okay? If you found a way to make them in the bathroom, that type of thing, that would be something that's very accommodating, okay? Those types of sensitivities. So, sometimes too, sitting toilets are becoming more common in the Muslim world, but traditionally the toilets in the Muslim world look like this. This is called a squat latrine, where you have the hole there, the drain hole, and then you have porcelain over it with two spots that you put your feet on, and then you squat down like a catcher in baseball, or at least how they used to squat. They kind of go on their knees now in baseball, but you squat down like a catcher in baseball and your stuff comes out, okay? Now, someone who's newer to the country, especially if they came from a refugee camp or they came from a more rural area or something, they probably went to the bathroom like this. When you do that, you contract different muscles in your abdomen than you do when you're on a sitting toilet. So sometimes it's like that level that people are getting, dealing with acculturation when they come in here. And again, I know you guys aren't in schools necessarily. This is a huge thing in like elementary schools especially, but just schools in general, of kids having to go through this culture clash. And again, it's a whole thing that like it eats away at kids' sense of self growing up, which can affect them as adults. There are many, many Muslim kids who don't go to the bathroom in school because these things are not accounted for. They hold it all day. That is not uncommon. I have parents all the time, kids telling me all the time that they do that. So it's something to be conscious of. Okay. Also, too, with bathroom etiquette, it's actually forbidden basically to speak while you're in the bathroom in Islamic etiquette. So there's no culture of like you knock on the door and be like, hey, how long are you going to be in there? Can you hurry up? That type of thing. Okay, that's something that Muslims, someone does that to them, they experience that as like embarrassing, So there's no culture of that. And just in general, too, all this stuff can make it so sometimes you're a little more deliberate and it takes a little more time in the bathroom because of all this washing stuff. So sometimes we take time with that. Okay, Bismillah. Any questions? Think of a question, okay? Still have an hour left. You don't have to ask it now, but do take a moment to think of the question so you can ask it later. And don't worry, people are always, religion's a very sensitive topic and stuff, so people are always kind of timid to ask, but don't be timid. Why don't you guys take a minute and like stand up and stretch and stuff? Okay, I know I'm talking a lot here. I can see you guys getting antsy in your seats. Talk to each other for a little bit. Take a little 5-minute break. Yes. Yeah.
How long? I mean, maybe we're talking like how long does the process take to do
Pray.
prayers?
Yeah. Well, the prayer itself takes 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
Now, when I talk to schools about this, they have the issue of you have a group of kids who need to pray. So when you pray, like, and actually, I didn't say it because you guys aren't teachers, but like in schools, they have all kinds of issues accommodating the prayers. And the thing that takes time is this washing beforehand, because they, what they always want to be told is it takes 5 minutes, it takes 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to put 5-10 minutes on the schedule there, we got it covered. But it just doesn't work like that, because the kids, they got to go to the bathroom, they got to do all this. If you have one sink, you have 10 boys who all need to use, this takes 2-3 minutes, just the process of washing. It's going to take them 20 minutes just to wash, So like in the Muslim world, a standard prayer break is 45 minutes. To handle all this gathering, the preparation, a little socializing that needs to be done, all that type of stuff. So, in the schools, that's a whole thing, in how it affects people's psychology, because most kids growing up in America, they do not perform these prayers successfully at school. Like, it takes a lot of will to really do it. And the kids themselves, they don't have the capacity to educate the school of what they need and all that type of stuff. If their parents didn't grow up here, they didn't have to go through that type of advocacy either, So that's the whole thing. And actually, I meant to mention, because the obligatory stuff in Islam it becomes obligatory for you upon puberty.
Okay.
Like as far as what you're held accountable for your record of deeds. So, I mean, it's just common experience here for adolescents. They get into puberty. You're supposed to be doing these things, but for all intents and purposes, like you can't really do it.
Right.
You get what I'm saying? So that affect.
In the mosque, is there extended bathroom, like big bathrooms that multiple
Yeah.
people can kind of do what they need to do?
Yes. When Muslims, there's actually one in Woodbury now. That is a mosque that was built to be a mosque. Other than that, every mosque in Minnesota is a second-run building. First thing the community always does when they get a building to be a mosque is they remodel the bathroom and they extend the bathroom. Always. First thing they do.
It's quite big.
It's big. Yep. You'll have, usually if they really have the money to do it, they'll put in a whole system where you have a sink that is here and a drain on the floor with like a barrier and then like a stool right here. Sometimes like a block stool. I'm gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can show you. This was in New York, but it's a good example one because it was in New York last week. Let me just get up for you here. Let me see here. See, this is a mosque just in New York. You see this?
That's what I was.
Those are all washing stations. Actually, for this video, and you see too here, like these are the stalls. Okay, like the whole like fire hazard space thing, like that's uncomfortable. You know, that's uncomfortable. And this is sometimes you have to have it that way due to regulations. And this place is in Farmingdale, New York. And this place they didn't. Yes, they built this. They built that specifically.
I can see how that would be really hard to remodel.
Exactly.
An older building.
It is. It is.
Destroying it.
Exactly. And this is a community. This is out in Long Island.
Okay.
So they're wealthier.
Sure.
So they are able to put together all like that.
A lot of it, I'm sure, is about how much money.
Completely. And just in Minnesota, we really struggle with that. And the weekend schools too. I don't know if I'll go over this with you guys because I teach teachers about what the schools are like. Like these weekend schools, the kids they're very crammed a lot of the times. See, like there, like this. Okay, this is in South Minneapolis. There's more demand for kids to be in those spaces than there is resources in the community to accommodate. So that's just something our community here in Minnesota really struggles with.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because you're not probably having the space to build these mega churches like
Right,
Exactly.
exactly.
Or whatever it is. Right?
Yeah, we will get there eventually. Like the community. Yeah, exactly. Like the community is increasing in socioeconomic status. The kids who grow up here, they're better educated, they're doing better. There is a move from being Somali's dominated the taxi driving industry. They've moved into truck driving, and they're making like 10 times as much doing that. It's not good for the kids necessarily because dad's gone all the time with that, but they are making more money that way.
Is there like unemployment kind of thing where you give a certain percentage as we give it back?
Well, there's nothing specific about that. Okay, there's nothing specific. Yeah, I mean, it's good. Like charity is good. Giving time into educating about the religion is good. I mean, Islam is an expansionist religion that you're supposed to proselytize. It is, but honestly, we don't do much of that because, especially in this community, actually, because of like the FBI entrapment and stuff. That I don't know if you know about the kids and that type of thing. So everyone's so paranoid about that type of stuff. It's not done that much. To be honest, that's something the African American communities out east do more of as well too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to leave a small comment about the Jenny Turkey processing plant in Wilmer.
Yeah.
I used to work there.
Oh, really?
And half people there it was still the case back then in like 2014 or something like that. Yeah, so that was really smart.
That's cool. That's cool. Appreciate that. Okay. Hello. Let's gather back in 2 minutes. 2 minutes, please. Let's gather back. All right. I'll give you a little deconstruction there. So we're going to turn into 1 minute. Let's move on. Okay, guys. Yes.
So observes your collection of clients who have substance issues or ordered not to use chemicals.
Yep.
In an observed space, is that something that we would be, I mean, would they be defying their religion if we're observing their urination?
Yeah. 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 I mean, if it's something you have to do legally, it's something you have to do legally. But definitely, especially if you're the opposite gender. Especially if you're the opposite gender.
We don't do that.
You don't do that? Okay, okay.
Gender observation.
Okay, okay. But yeah, still, that's still okay.
Any way of being respectful of their religion and still doing an observe, like what if we're not, I mean, because we're developing spaces where we're not actually in the room, but we're observing it from a window behind.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sure that would still be a violation.
Yeah. I should have put in the presentation. I took some video of the bathroom facilities of this mosque that I was in New York City last week. And this was a wealthier community where they could like really remodel the bathroom as they wanted. And there's only one in Woodbury. It is the only place where there is a mosque that is in a building that was built to be a mosque. Every other mosque in the Twin Cities and Minnesota is in a building that was not built to be a mosque. First thing the community always does when they get a building to be a mosque is they renovate the bathrooms. Part of that, if the fire codes allow for it, they will make the stalls like not have that space at the bottom, so to make it that enclosed. So yeah, I mean, privacy in this matter, it's a really big part of Muslim culture. It is a very big part of Muslim culture. There's no really getting around it. So this is where, we can talk more about after this because I don't know the details of like how that all plays out with that type of observed observation, So I'd be happy to like talk about the ins and outs of it because I'm sure there regulations that you have to follow with that. Yeah, I mean, sometimes that is what it is, like.
But I feel like there could be accommodations made. There could be an agreement with the client.
Right.
To do like a search of their person before they go into the bathroom.
Sure.
Search the bathroom to make sure there's nothing in them. I feel like there's got to be a legal conflict. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's definitely crossing a barrier of sensitivity without a doubt. So again, now you have the knowledge. So I mean, now you can, that's the thing too. Like with a lot of this stuff, even with schools, you need to know like what the rules are, so then you can game plan upon what you can do and what the rules allow for and all that type of stuff. And I'd be happy to talk more with you about that. Yes.
I mean, one thing, just talking about UAs and things like that. One of the things I experienced during Ramadan is that people aren't drinking all day long.
Yeah.
And our UAs are set up that they're usually afternoon.
UA?
People have it, the urinalysis where they
Okay, I
have
see.
urine sample.
I see. Okay.
And so most of our clients who are practicing
Yes.
haven't had anything to drink since before sunrise.
Yes.
And we're expecting them to come in and do UAs.
Yeah.
And we don't have good ways around like detecting alcohol other than UAs.
I see.
And so, it's just something to be aware of, I guess.
Yeah.
Are there other times other than Ramadan when?
Yeah. So fasting is an act of worship in Islam. Okay, it's obligatory during Ramadan for anyone, and actually everything that's obligatory, I meant to mention, it's obligatory upon adolescence, which doesn't mean you don't do it before that, like you're preparing to do it, but as far as like your religious accountability, it's adolescence. So fasting is an act of worship in Islam. So in Ramadan, it's obligatory to do it the whole month, except for unless you're sick, traveling on a journey, or for females who are menstruating or pregnant. And also the 5 daily prayers, females don't have to do them when they're menstruating. So outside from that, it's obligatory to them. But outside of Ramadan, it's not obligatory, but it's highly encouraged. And there are some practices of the Prophet Muhammad that are more likely to be followed than others. So he would fast on Mondays and Thursdays. He would fast on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of the month of the lunar calendar, which essentially means the days around the full moon. So there are some days like that where someone's more likely to be fasting. The day before our second Eid, our second holiday, which takes place in the Hajj season, which will be in June coming up, and I'll explain to you guys how the holidays work and how they change in the calendar. There is a day there called the Day of Arafat where it's not obligatory to fast, but it is highly, highly encouraged. So really throughout the year, the other thing too, days that you miss fasting during Ramadan because you're sick or menstruating or something like that, you have to make those days up before the next Ramadan. So outside of Ramadan, like fasting could be taking place at any time for those different reasons. Friday and Saturday are generally days where you're not supposed to fast, generally, unless you have some sort of pattern that it falls into of doing it. So fasting can be taking place anytime. So, I mean, if you guys can do it after sundown, a few hours after sundown, if there's a way to do that. People are very busy after sundown because of some extra worship that's done at the mosques, and you start getting like social activity a lot of times transfers to the nighttime during Ramadan. So you might not be able to do that, but if there's a way to do that, that'd be good. Otherwise, closely towards sun up. Okay, the good thing with this is Ramadan. I'll just go over it now that's come up, okay? So, I mean, have you guys noticed how when exactly Ramadan is changes from year to year? You've noticed that? Okay, so the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar, meaning it's based on the movement of the moon around the earth as opposed to the movement of the earth around the sun. So it is 10 or 11 days shorter than the Western calendar, or the Gregorian calendar as it's called, in a given year. 11 when it's a leap year. Also, too, in the Islamic calendar, each day is either 29 or 30 months. There's 12 months, but it is not predetermined which ones are 29 and which are 30. But rather what is done is on the 29th, by the direction of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Muslims are to look in the night sky at sundown or thereafter, and if they see the young waxing crescent, which is the first waxing crescent that appears after the new moon, if that is visible in the night sky, then the month you are in ends, and the next day is the first of the following month. And actually, in the Islamic calendar, the day actually begins with sundown, so you're actually in the first then, is what that means. If you don't see the crescent moon, then the month you are in becomes 30 days, and the next month begins after that. So because of that, the exact start date of when Ramadan happens, because Ramadan's the 9th month of the lunar calendar, you can't pinpoint it down to an exact date. And because this young waxing crescent is so thin, whether or not it's going to be, and there's so many factors involved in its visibility, whether or not it's going to be visible on any given point on Earth at any given point in time can't be projected with perfection within a 24-hour time span. There is a observatory in England and another one in Mecca that put a lot into projecting it as best they can. They are still wrong 4 out of 5 or 1 out of 5 times, 80% of the time. So they'll have projections of, like if you search on Google, when is Ramadan going to be in 2025? It'll give you a date that's based on the best projections that they have it, but it's still wrong 1 out of 20% of the time. So like leading up to Ramadan, you don't know totally. Okay, so that's the thing with it. Now, Ramadan next year is pretty much going to correlate with March, okay? Then after that, it will be like February 20th, or so, or 19th, 10th, 11th. Okay, it goes back 10 days like that. So the good thing now, it's getting into the winter. So the fasting is from sun up to sundown, from the time of the first prayer, from the time when the first prayer comes in, to when sunset happens, to that fourth prayer. That's the fasting window. So March 11th, this is when Ramadan began this last year. So, the good thing is, now I say the good thing, I mean, like when you get into in December, you'll have a little bit of time where once Ramadan's in December, it will be done fasting at like 4:30, so then you can schedule some urinary analysis as 5:30, 6 maybe. I mean, the thing is, too, you have to pray right when sundown happens, too, so that's the whole thing you have to accommodate. I mean, look, what I tell the schools, this has been a whole thing with standardized testing in the high schoolers, okay, because with it being in April and this type of stuff, it's standardized testing season. So I tell them it's just best to do it early in the morning as possible because that's closest to when you've eaten. You do eat and drink right before the first prayer when sunup happens, So that just the earlier in the day is probably the best time that you can do it, Yes. Yeah.
Okay, one really quick question I have. If we can go back to the prayer schedule.
Yeah.
Between praying and washing,
Yes.
how much of a time period is that?
Yeah, I mean, so the washing is just something you have to do before you can do the prayer. So it's not like praying happens, the washing happens at a set time and the praying happens at a set time. How much time does it take? I mean, it takes like 2-3 minutes to do the washing. Okay, maybe a little more if you got to disrobe. Maybe a little more if you use the bathroom before it because you don't want to have to be praying when you got to use the bathroom, that type of thing. The prayer itself, okay, the duration of the prayer takes it can take 3 to 5 minutes, maybe longer. There's some variables in like how long you want to recite the Quran during it, okay? The praying, it's a series of standing, bowing, and prostrating, and a certain amount of units of doing that. I don't know if you guys got to deal with seeing people pray,
Just if you're in the room with someone praying, you just don't want to stand right in front of them when they're standing. And if a male shouldn't watch a female pray, because that's kind of a sensitivity. So like the prayer itself, it can be done in like 10 minutes if you're really efficient with it, okay? But, like I tell schools, because schools always want to know how long does it take, and please just tell me it takes 10 minutes so I can put 10 minutes on the schedule and we can be done with it. But like it doesn't work that way at all, especially because of this washing, because the washing is what takes time. The schools will have, you have 10 boys who are going to pray, and they all need to do this washing. They have a bathroom with one sink. It's going to take each of them 2-3 minutes, And then what happens with the kids in that is they know that they're not really going to be able to get it done. So then they'll just take the break and goof off, and then that creates a whole thing, and these types of clashes have gone over the cool school system so much, So, it can be done efficiently, but the prayer is not something you're supposed to rush, okay? And even when you complete the full prayer, it's not something that's obligatory, okay? There's certain things that are obligatory to do in the prayer, certain invocations that you make, certain verses of the Quran that you recite, a certain amount and order of prostrating, bowing, and of standing, bowing, and prostrating. But it's encouraged to sit and reflect a little bit after you're done with that, to sit quietly and to recite under your breath some invocations. It's encouraged then too to do 2 more units of what is obligatory, basically. Okay, you don't have to, but it's an encouraged practice. So that is what is commonly done in homes, and certainly done when people go to the mosque to pray. So the thing is, there's just variables in the prayer that to the time, and the more it's accommodated for, the more efficient it can be done. The less it's accommodated for, the more likely someone is just going to skip it, which is not fun feeling for most Muslims. In the Muslim world, a prayer break is 45 minutes. It's 45 minutes. Businesses will close down. You'll block it off in the school schedule, all type of stuff. It's 45 minutes. You might not need that type of time, but it is something that, is a very deliberate process, okay? You guys don't want to worry about supervising people in prayer, but another thing to know about the prayer, it's not valid to do it in a room where there is images of living things hanging up on the walls. And that specifically means an image of the face of a living thing. So that's why if you go into a quiet room in a hospital, it's one of the reasons why they won't have any images up there, okay? If you're accommodating here in the courthouse or whatever, you want to have that type of thing. But also, so if you go into Muslim families' homes, this is why you will generally find that Muslims don't have pictures of all the grandparents and all the cousins up all over the walls and all that type of thing. Okay, Muslims don't do that because of this rule pertaining to the prayer. Because if you have pictures of living things hanging up, the prayer is not valid to be done. So sometimes, where the kids grow up and stuff, they're in a little bit more muted down environments than what they're used to. There is some Muslims who have inhibitions about picture taking in general. It is forbidden in Islam explicitly by a hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to draw the face of a living thing. There have been some, when cameras came along, there are some rulings from Islamic scholars that is like that, so it's forbidden. But most say it's a different thing, and especially if there's a purpose for ID and this type of stuff, then it's okay. But you might find some Muslims who have an inhibition about having their picture taken, unless it's absolutely necessary and that type of thing. You certainly will not find images of faces hanging up in mosques. You will never find that. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we got 25 minutes now. Okay, some people asked about clothing. Okay, so there's clothing rules for both men and women. Okay, as I was showing before, there's some things that are obligatory in Islam. There's some things that are encouraged because it's the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, but it's not explicitly said to be required. So what is required, what is obligatory for men and women is different, okay? What is obligatory for men is to cover everything from your navel to your knee. You're not actually supposed to have your knees showing. But what is encouraged for men and what is the practice of the Prophet Muhammad is really very similar to women. Because the Prophet Muhammad wore a full robe and he always wore a head covering, and you're supposed to have a beard too that covers your face. For women, what is obligatory is to cover everything but the hands and the face, essentially. and to really go by what is traditional in the Muslim world and what is taught explicitly in Islamic texts, is that includes the shape of the body. So that is why it's traditional for women to wear like loose robes and this type of thing. The face veil, there are some places where they consider it obligatory, but most places it's not obligatory. However, certainly in the Arab world, it really is the traditional practice of the Arab world for that women would cover their faces prior to colonization. The period of colonization in the 20th century changed all that to a fair degree, but that really is more tradition. But it is encouraged to cover the face. Now, the women have to dress this way when they are around men who are not their family members. Okay, that is the religious rule. So if they are at home or they are in a woman's only space, they don't have to observe that level of dress. Okay, in the now again, this is where accommodations come in. So like, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 3 years. Okay, women spend less time. Okay, a religious woman there will spend less time covered like this than a religious woman here. Because when she goes to a restaurant, the restaurant's going to have a place for single men, and it's going to have a place for families. And the families or single women can go to that place. And the table will have an enclosure if she wants it. Gyms will have a women's only section. Any place you go, it's going to have that type of women's only section. So this clothing becomes just something you wear in transition from one place to another. So Muslim women in the West are really put in a conundrum where, like, if they want to observe the actual rules of Islam, they're going to have to, like, do it a lot more than everyone else, and it will prevent them from, being creative in their dress or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with a Muslim women doing that. Okay, Paris Hilton, like Saudi Arabia, is like one of our biggest markets. Okay, your stores are all over the place, like that type of thing there. It's just that you just can't show it off to men who are not your family members. People like. So Muslim women in America, especially if they are born and raised here, they tend to not dress as conservatively as people in the Muslim world, and same with men as well. But this is like a conundrum for them. When you don't have women's specific places and that type of thing. Okay, yeah, so let's get into Ramadan. The third pillar is just paying an obligatory charity, which you don't need to know about necessarily. It might be relevant to you guys if you don't know. There is lots of rules pertaining to finance in Islam. The main one being that it is forbidden for a Muslim to partake in interest-bearing loans, either as the lender or the lendee. So, people who are suffering from debt or something like that can affect that. It affects kids going to college. There's people who will do it. Can affect the ability to own a home, all that type of stuff. More banks are having divisions that deal with Islamic banking. There is an organization out of Virginia called Guidance Residential that has members and branches all over the country that they do like an Islamic mortgage where it's like a shared ownership model where you can put down a down payment of 20%, which gives you 20% ownership, and then you gradually, month by month, buy back the ownership shares from them. But you have to pay, if you're living in the place, you have to pay rent at the same time. And sometimes, certainly when like U.S. Bank does that model, that you end up paying more than you would in a 30-year mortgage. So that's a whole thing and there's actually some people here who in Minnesota who work pretty deeply in Islamic finance who are, they're trying to get the banks to not take advantage of that type of system more. But that's the whole thing with finance, okay? Credit cards, a Muslim, you can take things out in credit, but you just can't pay interest on it. So you have to pay it back in a way where you're not going to pay interest, okay? Okay, so I said about Ramadan, I kind of got into Ramadan. Okay, fasting in Islam means abstaining from food and drink and sexual relations from the time of that first white light of the dawn to the setting of the sun. Ramadan's the 9th month of the lunar calendar. As I explained before, it is said to be the month when the first verses of the Quran were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it was the time when more of the Quran was revealed to them and when he would practice its recitation with the angel Gabriel. So in commemoration of that, there are extra prayers done in the nighttime during Ramadan after the night prayer that often go on for 60 to 90 minutes long. Those are not obligatory to do, but they're highly encouraged to do. And East African culture, especially, like everyone does those. So a lot of times people are in the mosques late during Ramadan. It's going to be less and less late as the night prayer gets to be earlier and earlier. But that is a whole other thing going on. It can affect people's sleep schedules and that type of thing. Okay, usually during Ramadan, there's meals held in the mosques at sunset. And a lot of socializing done after these different times and everything like that. Excuse me. Now, after Ramadan ends, okay, I explained to you guys the moon stuff. Is this? Yeah, there you go, okay. If you don't believe me about the crescent moon visibilities, I don't really know how to explain the science behind it, but believe me, it's there. So I give science teachers that sometimes. Oh, yeah, okay, just some things about eating etiquettes for Muslims. If you're ever eating with someone, okay, like now you adopt mixed things growing up here, but what is traditional in the Muslim world and what is the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is to use your hand, your right hand, and not use utensils to eat. Okay, so it's definitely a part of Somali and Arab culture that even things like rice and pasta, they will eat with the hands, okay? Traditionally, an eating gathering in the Muslim world is, you lay out a carpet or something. A lot of times they use tarps or a plastic sheet these days, and you have like a communal plate that everyone eats on, and you take from it. I deal with the schools, like sometimes, like the cafeterias, they're not set up for that type of eating. Sometimes the kids have different habits. And, when you eat from a communal plate, if you spill food, it's better that it falls off the plate. And then you remove the plates and you just gather the tarp up and shake out, and that's how you clean up. Whereas if you're doing like the Anglo, knife and fork type of eating, you want the food to fall on your plate, So sometimes there's different habits like that people have. It's also a thing in Islam that, in general, you do clean and honorable things with the right hand, and you do dirty things with your left hand. So you clean yourself in the bathroom with the left hand. You shake someone's hands with the right hand. Should you shake someone's hand of the opposite gender? No, you shouldn't in general. Okay, that's not something that's allowed in the religion generally, to touch a member of the opposite gender who is not your family member, basically. And really, Muslim cultures can differ upon this. Somalis are certainly more loose with this. But it's certainly an Arab culture. The closest a family member can be to you and be outside of being considered someone who you can touch that way is your first cousin. Your first cousin is still someone who you're not supposed to touch that way. Your brother and sister, it's fine. Your nieces and nephews, it's fine. Your aunts and uncles, it's fine. Of course, parents and grandparents, grandchildren, fine. But first cousin is out that. Some cultures, especially East African culture, they're a little more loose with that. It's taken in several schools of Islamic jurisprudence that touching someone of the opposite gender is outside your family breaks your wudu. There's somewhere and I actually think it's the more sound opinion, but there's somewhere that refers to only sexual touching with your spouse, or like something you wouldn't do outside of marriage, ideally, this type of thing, but that was the cultural practice in a lot of places. Now, people who grow up here, they tend to be less sensitive to that, and you've usually been put in a situation where you were pressured to do that, so, you don't feel, so you're okay doing it. I personally do that, okay? If I'm in a professional type situation, woman puts her hand out to shake my hand, I will shake her hand. But, I grew up here and have the more someone's grown up here, the less likely they are to have those sensitivities. What Muslims will do with one another, okay, when you're greeting one another, someone from the opposite gender, you will put your hand on your heart and just kind of do a short, very small bow, like, it's nice to meet you, that type of thing. That is what we will do instead. So you can do that in lieu. But I get asked that. It's better to assume to not shake someone's hand of the opposite gender. Yeah, in Arab culture, that's extremely sensitive. Okay, that's extremely, like, one glance is fine because you need that for like locating that type of stuff. And I actually had it up here. There's a specific injunction about lowering your gaze in the Quran. That is a very, very well-known verse where I have right here. Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, and that will make for greater purity for them. And Allah is well acquainted with all that they do. So it's fine once, okay? It's fine once. It's fine amongst initial contact, all that type of stuff. Really, if you're talking to someone like professionally, most people here, again, some people are less sensitive to if they grew up here. it's going to be fine if you're interacting with them directly. But if it's not someone you're interacting with directly, okay, especially if you're like with a family and it's just like, someone on the side of the room, it's better not to. It's really better not to. I come from a mixed family, a mixed religious, mixed ethnic family. So, I got married in a mosque, and the person marrying us did not look at my female family members. And to this day, that is a thing that my non-Muslim family, because they interpret that as being rude. But, to him, that's interpreted as being respectful, And to this day, that is something I have my non-Muslim family members bring up to me as like, well, I was, yeah. Okay. All right, so look, with holidays. Okay, the fifth pillar is Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, which you only have to do once in your lifetime. But going to Mecca itself is an act of worship you can do any time of the year, but Hajj itself, the Hajj season, takes place within a particular time in the 12th month of the lunar calendar. That is coming up in June. Okay, so a holiday in Islamic culture is called Eid, E-I-D. We have two holidays, Eid al-Fitr, which takes place the first day after Ramadan. Okay, first day of the 10th month of the lunar calendar. And the second one takes place within the Hajj season. Okay, so Eid after Ramadan was April 10th. I believe Eid this upcoming year is June 17th is when it is projected by around right now, okay? That one for sure when the month turns before, which is like 10 days before. So just understand these things will be changing, okay? Next year, Eid is going to be like March 30th or 31st. Then the other Eid will be June 7th, and then so on and so forth, back like that. Okay, Eids, there's a big congregational prayer in the morning, usually in the mosques if the weather is warm. Sometimes they're held outside or like in the convention center. It's like other holidays, other traditions. Kids get presents, gifts, all that type of stuff goes on. And people want the day off work and all that type of stuff, okay? Last thing I'll get on, then I'll open up, think about questions you want to ask, that type of stuff. This is the tenets of belief in Islam, okay? It's part of Islamic belief that there is an unseen world within the creation amongst us that one cannot perceive with their five senses. And principally what is in that unseen world is two types of creatures. One that is called angels, and the others that are called jinns. Angels are described in Islamic teachings as creatures that God created from light who submit to God's command without any choice in the matter. And their primary role is recording the deeds that you do. So every individual has an angel on their right side that records their good deeds and an angel on their left side that records their bad deeds. The jinns are creatures that are made from fire, and they are the only creature aside from humans in Islamic teachings that have the choice of whether to obey or disobey God. So a jinn can be a Muslim who obeys God, but the jinns who disobey God, who are evil, they are what you would call devils. Or shayateen. Shaitan is the singular. It's like the word Satan. Shayateen is the plural. So Satan in Islamic understanding is not some guy with horns and a pitchfork who rules over the hellfire. He is something that exists in this world that has a progeny. And the role of the shayateen is to whisper into the ears of mankind to make evil deeds look tempting. Okay? So sometimes Muslims, they can interpret like tempting type of thoughts or like negative self-thought as like the shayateen whispering to them, because Islamic teachings and texts actually talk a lot about this. There is a concept in Islam that you can be possessed by a jinn. That is something that happens Islamically, and the cure for that is like having the Quran read over you. Okay, it's quite a big thing in East African culture. It's not just them, but, so sometimes, and actually a lot of young Muslim professionals in this country are like getting into mental health areas, this type of things. And I have a list of mental health service providers that I'll send you guys in a follow-up email who are all Muslim in the Twin Cities. But sometimes like this schema of thinking affects people's interpretations of mental health. and people going to the imam or the sheikh in a masjid and asking for him to read the Quran over them to cure him of mental health type illness. That's something that's common. None of that negates like medicinal use of any type. And actually, like medicine is a pretty highly revered profession in Muslim culture, in part because the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that every illness that Allah creates, he also creates a cure for, so seek it out. So medicine has always been highly revered in Muslim culture, but sometimes there is like also along with it, or sometimes in lieu of it, these interpretations of mental illness that relates to this way of thinking that, you just have to navigate with a little bit and that type of thing. Okay? So we have about 20 minutes. Okay, guys? Think of some questions, all right? I'll give you some specific things. That, or I'm going to ask you guys to tell me a little bit more about like what your day-to-day life is as probation officers, so I know more what to relate to things.
So you said that you came from a mixed family. So were you raised Muslim, or were you?
I wasn't.
You were not.
I wasn't.
When, how did that process? When did you? How were you converted?
You asking about me personally? No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, my great-grandfather was from Syria. Okay, so when I do this more extensively, I go into a little deeper history, because there was a lot of Arab immigration in the early 20th century, which was mostly spurred by Henry Ford. Henry Ford specifically hired Arabs from Yemen and Lebanon to work at his car factories in Michigan. So if you look up Dearborn, Michigan, that is the city in America with the highest population of Arabs, and the Arab American Museum is there. It's like over 60% Arabs. It goes back to that time. So there was a lot of Arab immigration there, but that was where the primary Muslim Arab immigration was. But 90% of Arab immigration from that time was Christian Arabs. But there were like a few Muslims. There was actually, too, interestingly enough, the first building that was ever registered as a mosque in the United States. Okay, there were like mosques in Michigan, but they didn't like tell the government about it. But the first building that was ever registered as a mosque in the United States was in Ross, North Dakota, which is in some small town, because some people, and there was also a Muslim family that lived in Morris, Minnesota in 1898. So some of those people, a lot of them, like they had rural agricultural backgrounds. So they might have come into New York City or Detroit or that type of thing, but they ended up seeking out like more rural areas. And some of that affected the Midwest. Also, too, the oldest continually operating mosque in the United States is in Grand Rapids, Iowa. I can't remember if it's Grand Rapids or Rapid City, but it started in 1934, and it's a historical site now. Yeah. So my father was not religious at all. Okay, when I grew up. Yeah, and my mother was Catholic.
Okay.
So yeah. Yes. Yes.
I'm curious about the priorities of the 5 pillars.
Yeah.
Are they directly related then to like what's most obligatory and what's
Yes.
most forbidden?
They are. Yeah. Like violating that first pillar is called shirk. Okay, shirk in Arabic means to share. So it means sharing God's attributes with something else. And Allah says in the Quran that shirk is the only sin that he will not forgive on the day of judgment. So it is considered the most, in that sense, it's the most egregious sin. Okay? If you're living under an Islamic government, it's not necessarily the sin that's given the most extreme punishment. But as far as your reckoning on the day of judgment, it's the most serious sin. Now, even within that, you'd be really surprised how detailed Islamic jurisprudence is. Every sin, actually, there's major and minor levels of it. So there is always degrees of this type of thing. Too, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was a real historical person, and his companions, 7th century. So when you read about their rulings and all this stuff they did, it is all much more practical than you might think, because it all really relates to real life scenarios and all this type of thing. But yes, there's these different variations, all that type of stuff. And there's major and minor sins in the religion. Yeah, yes. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, this might be a little more complex, but one of the things I wonder about, I grew up in Minneapolis, I live in South Minneapolis,
Yeah.
and I've seen kind of a switch and a change, and that things are getting really, really hard with the young people in the community. And I'm wondering, and I don't know that the criminal justice system right now is really reaching a lot of the young people in a way that's beneficial.
Sure.
and I'm wondering if somebody who's worked as an educator, you know, and obviously is, you know, incredibly versed in this, you know, what do you think the criminal justice system and people in the criminal justice system can do to really try to help the young men and women?
It's a really good question. I mean, I need to learn more about the criminal justice system to try to get a hold on that. So I hope you guys will help me with that. You know, look, like to me, this whole like beneath the surface cultural clash. I mean, you can see from this how it's just kind of like this constant thing. You know, it's like constantly eating away at you. You know, there's you know, especially with Somalis. I mean, first of all, if you just look at world surveying, you will find that Muslim countries are always people are more identify themselves as religious more frequently than people in the Western world. The highest of them is Somalia. Okay, the Somali, over 99% of people identify themselves as either religious or very religious in Somalia. So you have these cultures where like someone's good character and conduct, it's entirely tied to religion. Like you can't avoid it. And then you put them in a school system where like, you know, there's a separation of church and state. You know, this is why I wrote my book and stuff. And you know, so in the school system, they need to talk about religion a little bit more. Because some people have the misperception, like, you know, it's not like we live in the Soviet Union or France where religion is like banned. You know, actually people have religious rights in the school system. And you can talk about religious ways of thinking and that type of stuff within the curriculum without endorsing any one way. So, like, I mean, I honestly think that's a good, big thing. And also, too, I mean, there's good reason why people are sensitive about religion. So in polite society, in general, you don't talk about religion much, you know. But Muslims could maybe benefit from people, like, trying to just make that type of talk a little bit more explicit, you know. I mean, you know what code switching is? You heard this term in psychology, okay? Like, Muslims are code switching all the time because you'll be with Muslims and operate one way, and you're referring to like God all the time with that, and then you are around non-Muslims and you switch it off. And I mean, you go to the Arab world, it's not that way between Arab Muslims and Christians. It's not that way. You know, the same like vernacular and stuff that's used, it's used across them, this type of thing, you know. So I mean that's a thing, you know. And I think like many of the young people, you know, Somalis especially, Muslim cultures in general, they're more collectivist than Western society, and less individualistic. So I would say parenting in the Muslim world, it's done more collectively in a way, okay? It's because you can let your kid out in the neighborhood or whatever, and just be assured the neighbor or the teacher, everyone's going to be reinforcing the same thing the same way upon the kid. So you can kind of keep the kids in line a certain way, and everyone just, you know, just does it based on tradition. So a lot of times Muslim parents, they're less ready to give kids kind of like individual coaching, like to talk them through emotional reasoning and that type of stuff, because of that, because they maybe didn't get that growing up. And then too, especially if the parents are immigrants, they didn't go through all the same trials that the kids are going through, you know? So, you know, with Somali kids especially, you know, you look at the boys, they are like so group dependent. Okay, their little friend groups just like mean everything to them. And they will give their lives to it sometimes. Why is that? It's because like that's where they get the most connection. It's also where they can set up a criteria of what it means to be good and be successful with it. So like, you know, they're not being very successful in school overall. You know, like the integration with the society is fraught with all these different things. But they can get together as teenagers and decide this or that is cool, and then they can be successful with it. Well, then what influences their ideas of that? You know, it's pretty much all negative things. But that's the thing they're the most attached to. And because they are always around each other. Okay, that's the way the community really tries to parent. Okay, that's why you have the charter schools that are all Somali kids. It's why you have, you know, cramming them into the mosques on the weekend. Okay, because the idea is just kind of so long as we get them in the right place where they're together, you know, it's like there will be some modicum of protection. But it doesn't really happen that way. So the kids, you know, social interaction is good. It's a good thing they have going through. They're always interacting with one another. But they're not always kind of like stopped and asked to think like explicitly what's going on in their minds. And sometimes they need to even like be fed some ideas or told about explicitly what's going on in their minds. That's why, look, I honestly think this is a really good book for the kids to read. It honestly is. Because like it goes through his mind, through his whole life development and this type of stuff. So it gets a young person thinking about that and all that type of stuff, you know? Yeah.
You mentioned that there's like more, getting more and more Muslim mental health professionals.
Mhm.
I have some clients in my caseload who are from that background, and I've talked to some of them about how like it is hard for them to open up for like one specific instead of their dad, like not allowed to talk about feeling depressed or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you see that kind of cultural shift changing?
Well, you know, actually, what I'm concerned about is kind of an over backlash from the youth. You know, like so. You know, there's nothing wrong with mental health therapy and care and all that type of stuff. You know, in the religious teachings. You know, the immigrant parents, okay, especially the refugees ones. You know, they went through a lot. Okay, they went through a lot, so they tend to have like this gridded out type of attitude. You know, and they tend to have things that they went through which are worse than whatever the kids go through. And they got over it in their way, So that tends to be what they put on the kid. That tends to be the reactionary thing that they do put on the kid. And American kids like they just won't see it that way, and they don't know what it's like to grow up here. So I mean, there is a lot of young people who they've gone to college. Their psychology is, if you go to Augsburg, like lots of East African kids go there, psychology is a very, very common major there amongst Somali kids, especially amongst females. And that is because of this kind of recognized need, My concern is with them like overreacting. Like those fields need to know more about Muslim culture itself and the psychology because it needs to be integrated, because sometimes kids, they go there and they come out convinced that, their parents are people who they need to abandon and this type of thing. Like there's things like that going on in the community. And I they need to learn empathy for their parents as well, that type of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Based upon the information that you provided, is it important for male probation officers to work specifically, or male, I guess men to work with men and women to work with women?
Yeah, I think so. But again, I don't know all the dynamics of your guys' work. So maybe not necessarily, I mean, I get asked that about, and maybe kids are a little different. I mean, I get asked that about teachers. And my answer to that is honestly not necessarily, and because I've been in schools and I've seen the kids act terribly towards a male teacher and that teacher get replaced by a female teacher. And it works much better. Like the personal disposition matters a lot, and to speak about teaching, because that's what I know about in education, like managing a classroom, kids who are going through stuff, you need to be calm with them, So like what I've seen with teachers is like, it's the teacher who has a calm disposition, especially when the kids challenge them that they need. That's more important than the gender actually, So I do think like there's definitely things to consider with it, but I wouldn't say it's like an absolute rule. I wouldn't say that. Yeah. Bismillah.
What questions do you have about that?
Well, I want to know what you guys do on a daily basis, okay? And I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's not like the same every day, but is most your day home visits? Like give me your 9 to 5. Like what takes place? And does your work just take place during 9 to 5 too? Okay. What do you do on a daily basis?
Well, I think it depends on if you're a juvenile agent or if you're an adult agent, but I would open it up to all of you to answer that.
If we have a case like from the beginning, so even before someone's sentenced, there's people that are doing like pre-sentence reports and trying to learn about the person and what happened,
Okay.
their version. And then there's usually after sentencing, there's like an intake process to figure out what level of kind of supervision.
Okay.
And then sometimes based on the offense, they might go to a specific agent, and then there's ongoing visits, either in office and community, different frequencies based on the offense.
Okay.
Some people are placed on probation for a shorter time, depending on, some might be for a really long time.
So do you guys all specialize in different areas of offense?
There's like a general high-risk caseload.
Okay.
They have like robberies, drugs.
Okay.
There's a domestic unit.
Yep.
Sex offender unit.
Okay.
Juvenile.
Okay. Okay. And is all that's all represented here amongst you guys? Okay. Okay. That's good to know. All right.
Is there anything we need to know if we're going into a home of someone that practices supervision or?
Best to take your shoes off, you know. I mean, like, you know, the things
We
about.
do have a policy that states we're not to take our shoes off.
Well, that's okay. Never mind then.
But again, I mean, some of these things we should know and talk about and accommodate. So it's really
Correct.
good for us to know that that's.
And at least let them know, you know. At least let them know, like I have a policy I need to follow to not take my shoes off. You know, I do. You know, I'm kind of interested in how you guys talk to people, and I mean, there's probably a little bit much to talk about right now. Okay, so you have someone who is a sex offender. You have someone who, you know, was selling drugs or whatever. You know, like, and you go and visit them. Are you given like protocols of what you're supposed to go over with them, or is it more open? Like, I'm curious. You know, there has to be a certain art if you're trying to support the person to not fall back into their offense, right? There has to be a certain like art to that. Is that
I usually
is that
do
correct?
like I work in a high risk unit, so I supervise men, adult men that are assessed to be mostly high risk to reoffend and get new charges.
Okay.
And usually in the first meeting with them, I go over their court order, and like 90% of my dudes have substance use issues. So it's like,
Okay.
you have this condition for no alcohol controlled substance use.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can try to work with you, like what is your drug of choice? Try to talk about that.
Yeah.
Talk about treatment options.
Yeah.
And kind of get that mapped out ahead of time. And then
Yeah.
kind of go through you can try to avoid getting a violation and going back to court if they do X, Y, and Z, follow this court order stuff.
Okay.
And I do notice that I think certain people are more likely to be open up than other people, right?
Sure.
But yeah, usually kind of go over a basis in those initial meetings.
Okay. Yeah, and you know, with going into a home, are you guys juvenile and you guys are adults, or it's just all over? You know, look, I will just say like a lot of the parents, they're growing up like in denial about what the kids are going through. So there is that element there, okay, especially for immigrant parents. I've seen a lot of that, okay, like just denial. Because the kids really like get into this kind of dual existence, you know, and for some of them, unfortunately, it goes into their 20s and 30s, this type of thing. I think someone asked in the intake form about like trust with law enforcement. I mean, I would say that those issues exist, okay, like the Somali community, especially in general, they've had a negative experience with the Minneapolis Police Department overall. And, you know, we've dealt with various rounds of FBI entrapments, if you're not aware of that. You know, concerning 2015, some kids getting entrapped by FBI agents to do something that amounted to them supporting ISIS, and now they're like in jail for 25 years, this type of thing. That had an extreme scarring on the community. Okay, the community is still ruptured because of that. And I would say too, actually, after that happened, that messed with the kids' religious identity a whole lot, because the parents then became afraid of the kids like dressing religiously or this type of thing, because they thought that might make them a target and all that type of stuff. And then those kids, they kind of grew up to be like some of those kids who got big on YouTube as rappers, like some of them were in like those weekend schools, like as much as anybody. But, you know, then they got the message from their parents. It's like, well, okay, we're concerned about that now. So they went to the other extreme and that type of thing. So there is some trust issues like that. You know, I would say too, the best you can do of just explicit explaining to people how systems and policies work is good, okay? Even the history of why it's developed and how it exists in its current form is good. You know, special ed teachers and even ESL, which is my area in school, they can have some issues with this, like families not wanting to be systematized, sort of, so they don't want the kid in special ed. You know, giving them a presentation of how, like, you know, how special ed came to be, the types of families who first advocated for it, what policies passed, and why that manifests as exactly what you see in front of you. That can be helpful. You know, same thing with ESL, you know, like just relating to that history. That can always be good. Yeah, I would say.
How about opposite gender staff supervising? Like I have a high risk male caseload, juvenile.
Sure.
So I have teenage boys. and
Sure.
Typically meet with them alone, is that?
No, well, look, in Islam, there's sensitivities. It is actually forbidden to be in an enclosed room with someone from the opposite gender if it's just the two of you. If it's a group, it's fine. Okay, there is actually rules against that. So, like, I advise school teachers if they need to talk one-on-one to a kid, and they're going to do it in their classroom, to at least have the door open if it's someone from the opposite gender. So there is sensitivities about that. I would say people growing up here, they're a little less aware or sensitive to that sensitivity. So if you have to meet one-on-one with a person who's of the opposite gender, it is best if at least the door is open. You know, if it's a group, it's no problem, though. If it's a group, it's no problem. Yeah. Question. Okay, I will send out to you guys, I'll send you like a feedback form type of thing. If you leave like a nice testimonial, that will be helpful for me to get this to other places. I'll send you the list, I'll send you the slides, I'll send you the list of Muslim mental health providers, and you have my email so you can reach out to me at any time. Okay, thank you.
so much.
Thank you. Yep.